Hi, and welcome back to Not Another Safety Talk. I'm Simon Leppan, the National Fire Team Manager at Citation. With me, I've got David Taylor, the Advice Team Manager at Citation. So today we're going to talk about stress and wellbeing in the workplace. Last month was Stress Awareness Month, and now we're moving into Mental Health Awareness Month. And today we actually have a guest with us. So we've got Kelly Calman from the HR team. Kelly, can you tell us a bit more about who you are and what you do, please?
Yeah, of course. So I head up the employment law team, which is currently a team of nearly 100 now within Citation, so between consultants and managers.
Fantastic, thank you. So we want to talk about stress and well-being. It's a very important topic. We see a lot more of it now, David, don't we?
Indeed.
Certainly from the health and safety side, but there's an enormous crossover into HR. And I think historically there's been a lot of blurred lines between the two. I think, from my experience now, a lot of the industry in safety and HR together are starting to get more clarity, which is definitely a good thing. But I'm certainly seeing from the HSE's perspective, there's a strong focus on the organisation now, isn't there?
We are seeing that, and ultimately that comes from, I think last year there was 22.1 million days lost due to stress, anxiety and depression. So when it comes to this, I like to think about it as like the invisible hazard that we've never really thought about much in the past, and now we're seeing is that there's a heavy focus on that.
And I think that hazard piece is key, isn't it? Because we often think of mental health as being an isolated thing for an individual, but the reality is in a workplace, there's a lot of things that will contribute to stress. So there's the obvious things like workload, lack of information, lack of clarity, that can contribute to stress. But that is a hazard ultimately.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I like to think about it as like carbon monoxide, right? So we look at it in that way, whereas obviously it's invisible and you can't smell it. And typically when you realise that it's there, is that it's too late. And ultimately it's the exact same thing when we're looking at stress. Typically we'll see that you'll have high absence rates. You might have your exit interviews and stuff of why people are leaving. So from a health and safety point of view, is that we want to be proactive, and we're looking at where is your detectors to highlight that you've got an issue, and that's where from an HSE perspective of what they want us to be looking at is to look at and identify where our issues are, and that's where the stress indicator tool comes into place.
And Kelly, from a stress perspective on the HR side, you'll see the impact of stress on individuals more so than we're perhaps looking at the organisation. What sort of things are you seeing at the moment, or are there any trends or anything you're seeing at the moment to do with stress with our client base and the wider workforce?
So definitely seeing it more across the board, to be fair. So it is really important for clients to be looking out even for odd behaviours and things like that. You'll often see it, if you've got a really good relationship with employees, don't just ask once, are you okay? Ask twice, because a lot of the times, you know what it's like. If someone says, are you okay? You go, yeah, I'm okay. But if you ask again, they'll often actually go, no, I'm not actually. So it is drilling down into that, and it's just noticing differences in behaviours, because that's normally how you actually realise that there's a problem. And again, we're seeing a lot more what's called presenteeism now. So that is where an employee is coming into work, but actually they're not well enough to be at work. And a lot of the time that is mental health, or as you say, stress, which of course can be a contributing factor to mental health in the first place. So it's important when there is absences and things like that, you're doing return to work meetings, and again, really drilling down into what is it, and ultimately, is there anything that we can be doing differently to help you in this situation?
The interesting thing there, some of the things you just talked about, the HSE are clued up to as well. So, we know that there's a fundamental, you need a stress risk assessment for your organisation. But for a while now, people have thought that'll do the job. If the HSE come in, they're just going to look for that stress risk assessment. But we've very quickly seen them move beyond that. So they're looking more at implementation. Is it actually working? Is it valid? Is there stress within the workforce that risk assessment, is it just a paper exercise? So things there like absenteeism, they'll ask, And this is the things that our clients can do to check their own sort of performance with stress, I suppose, is ask those questions like, how many people are actually off at the moment with an unexplained absence or because of stress, and what impact is that having on the business? But also having that reality check of walking around the site and asking the team, do you know what you're doing? When I was in inspections and enforcement, but also in the inspection role as a consultant, one of the things I would always look out for is people on the work floor asking or saying things like, yeah, we never have time to get that done. We're stretched, we do too much, so-and-so's off all the time with stress, so we're all working too hard and we're never going to get them. All those little indicators, those real conversations can give you an indication if there's actually a stress problem. But you don't always get to find that, and people can be different with you because they know what your role is. So I think, David, there's some things that we look at from a more organizational perspective, or there's certainly some tools out there, aren't there, that can help an organization to really unravel whether they have a stress problem that's going under the radar, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think that's the main thing, is being proactive. So it is broken down into management standards, right? And they've ultimately broke it down into 6 key areas. So we have demand, and obviously where we look at demand, that is obviously can be the workload and obviously demand that has, but it also looks at what's the expectation on people. Are we expecting them to be answering emails at 9 o'clock at night? If you have rotas and shift work, is that planned well in advance so that people can organise like childcare and so on as well? So that's where you look at that demand. And when we look at these 6 areas, I like to look at it as you know how you'd have in music, like the switchboard, like the controls, and you would dial it up and down so that the sound came out well. I always think about it like that. So if your demand is high, then we go into the next step, which is control. And that ultimately looks at the individual.
Sure.
and how much control and autonomy do they have for their work.
Absolutely.
So that is a big thing, because ultimately what's high demand for me might be different for you. So where you're giving people that we've got tight deadlines, we've got a lot of work to do, but you're giving them control to decide, all right, I'm going to work at home today because it gives me more time to focus in on the work to get it done. That's something that you can dial up, and you're giving them that control. And then that feeds into a next pillar that they have, which is role, and people understanding their role, what their objectives are. But as well as that is that maybe who they report into. What you can see is that people have 2 or 3 different managers, and that can complicate things, and they're given different tasks. So it's really important that they understand that. And then that feeds into support, which is another pillar. And that looks at 2 different areas. We're looking at support as in, do they have the right systems, technology, things like that to do the work. And then obviously having that sort of emotional support for like their managers and stuff like that as well. And then the next pillar is relationships.
Right.
So obviously it's key, we all understand that having better relationships with people and stuff, that is, you get to be your best self, you can enjoy work. But as well as that, is a big thing, is that from an organizational standpoint, where they look at like bullying and harassment and like that toxic environment, how that's dealt with in the workplace. If that's just left, then obviously that can have an impact on individuals and stress. And then the final pillar is change. So how do you as an organization deal with change? How do you go about that and make sure that you include your employees, that you give them well in advance and let them get involved to understand of changes that are coming? How are you training them and so on? Because again, as human, we don't enjoy change. So that has a big impact and stress. So that's what it's looked like, as those 4 components is where you need to be moving those dials up and down to be making sure that you have an understanding of where someone is with stress. And ultimately what that will do is, as an organisation, it will just give you an overview of where issues may lie. You know, I always think of it like an MRI. Like it gives you, it'll identify where there is issues.
Yeah.
And then as a employer, you then need to look to break that down, you know, and maybe have a focus group within areas of the business. If you identify that maybe in sales that they have issues with support, then you would have a focus group on and try to get an understanding of where those issues come from. Now, you're not going to say what stresses you, because you're going to sit there and listen to someone tell you for a long time, is where obviously you're going to have focus in on to say you've highlighted that you don't have support with this, and then it allows you to focus in on that.
I think with a lot of that, what we're talking about here is stuff that feels naturally very HR based ultimately. So I think for a lot of health and safety professionals, they're going to feel out of their comfort zone getting into a lot of this. And there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, there's going to be a lot of perceptions, and certainly from a management and leadership point of view, you can think everything's great, but there could be an underlying problem. So I think one of the things that, people listening to this could take on board to help them with that is that there is a HSE toolkit, wasn't there? Which takes away some of that burden to get underneath the surface layer and figure out what's going on, which is survey based. So it allows you to input who's in your workforce. You send the surveys out, you get the honest, anonymized feedback back, and then it analyzes it and provides you with a report saying these are some of your problems and this is what you need to focus on and where to address. And I think for a lot of health and safety professionals, something like that is a fantastic starting point, because otherwise it can be something we just unsure of. It's new, you can easily get lost.
I think
but it has that impact.
Something there is, as leaders, managers, and so on, like you can feel uncomfortable, as though that is putting a lot of pressure on you to be able to deal with this. And ultimately, that's not it whatsoever. It's just about recognizing that there's maybe an issue, and then what steps to take from it. And maybe that's from your side, Kelly, where we're looking at employee assistance programs and so on.
Yeah, so employee assistance programs are great because it does mean that employees have got that outlet to be able to speak to someone that's not in the business if they don't feel comfortable. But you're absolutely right, David. It is about bringing in a culture where employees do feel comfortable speaking to kind of anyone within the business. It might be peer-to-peer, it might be speaking to their managers, just about how they're feeling and actually kind of what's going on in the workplace. Change is definitely something, as you say, there will definitely be changed in when you're trying to get to a less stressful place. There'll be things that you're wanting to change. Bringing your employees, I should say, on board with that is absolutely critical, because if you just put a change in, it will inevitably make people uncomfortable. It will make people anxious. And you might have people that obviously take on things on board easier than other employees. And that sometimes is due to medical conditions and things like that. So what stresses out one employee, someone else might be absolutely fine with. But actually, it is about looking at it on that individual level. And that's why having a almost inclusive culture where people do feel comfortable in speaking to people actually really helps, because then if there are, obviously employers have a duty of care and a duty to put in place any reasonable adjustments where there are kind of disabilities and things like that. And while stress is not a disability in itself, actually it can be the underlying cause. And if there is a disability that is, say, anxiety or depression, it absolutely can bring it on and make it worse. So it is just about having those conversations with those employees and putting in place reasonable adjustments where needed, really.
I think when we look at this and something to consider is just how much the workplace has changed, right? So if we go back, it was always, right, you're traveling to your place of work, you're doing 9 to 5, and then you're going home. Whereas now, the way the world is that's completely changed. Whereas people are working from home, there's your hybrid working and so on. So a big issue here is that they're at home a lot, and it can be difficult to separate, well, what stress is coming from work and what stress is coming from the home environment. You know, and that's one of the challenges we face. But I think that no matter where the stress is coming from, as an employer, it suits us best to make sure that we're trying to manage that because obviously if someone is, whether they're stressed in work or stressed at home, it has an impact on them in work. And especially when we're talking about health and safety, is that it impacts obviously people's brains, and they're more likely to do something wrong and have human error, which can obviously cause accidents and so on. So that's why it's so key as well for us, is obviously in health and safety.
I think since COVID, we've definitely seen that, and we've that move to a home-based workforce, and also greater awareness of mental health. A lot of people went through a very hard time and came out of it with that increased awareness. So the workforce are aware as well. I think the whole society has become more aware of mental health and stress. Kelly, have you seen a trend on that from a HR perspective? Are you dealing with people working from home? Is that, because I'm guessing that's a fairly new thing in the HR world?
Yeah, it is to a certain extent. So the hybrid working, and I think what we're seeing, almost as you say, after COVID, there was a trend of everyone worked from home, and therefore you were seeing more issues around isolation and people struggling with their mental health, almost because, like you say, they weren't getting out, they weren't socialising, they were working from home constantly at some points, depending on the employer. And we're now starting to see a shift of employees trying to come back into the workplace, or some businesses wanting employees back in the workplace. So we are seeing now not only kind of mental health that comes from that, but a lot more actual requests for flexible working, either to be in the workplace more or to work from home. And again, it's a very individual level. So it's a lot of employers will say they just want a blanket policy. But ultimately, it does need to be a bit more flexible than that in a lot of cases. So, of course, there's some employers where you can't work from home. It's not possible, manual labour, things like that. But where you can work from home, often having that hybrid model actually works for a lot of people. But again, it's really individual.
There's been some massive changes in HR legislation
Oh,
this year, haven't
100%,
there?
yeah.
Has that had any impact on stress and well-being, or do you foresee that it could do?
I think the one thing it'll actually have an impact on, and I think this is more relevant to the statutory sick pay changes that have just happened. Of course, now the waiting days have been removed and employees are paid effectively from day one in terms of statutory sick pay. I actually think what may happen there is you see a shift that more employees that were turning up to work when actually they shouldn't be probably aren't going to be, purely because they're now being paid more. So I think that will be a slight shift in it, to be fair. But I think that's, from an employee point of view, that's only a good thing. Employers may perceive that as a bad thing, particularly sectors such as cleaning, security, because they're going to need more cover. They're going to have to go to agency workers more and things like that. But ultimately, from an employee perspective, where they're genuinely struggling with their mental health, actually that's a good thing, because it doesn't mean they're having to come to work for the financial burden that they may suffer if not.
That makes a lot of sense. I suppose that's a benefit to health and safety as well, because if you've got more people, off with mental health when they should be, you're going to get a better indicator of your level of stress within the workplace.
Yeah. And that's why it's good, as I say, to do your return to works and things like that, because if there are, don't get me wrong, there might be people that want to take a bit of a duvet day because they're being paid from day one, and that's where your return to work, you're actually going to get down into that and see, is this genuine or not? Because like I say, from an employee point of view, where it is genuine, it's an absolute benefit, but where it's not genuine, that's where it could be tricky for employers to manage.
I think a key thing from health and safety is that you can look at, obviously, your stress management, risk assessment, implement the controls and stuff, like when you carry out and use the stress indicator tool and stuff. However, the key to it is culture and leadership.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
if you have all of this in place, but your culture is that if people are leaving at 5 o'clock when they're meant to be, and that's seen as a bad thing, then ultimately that falls away. So for it to be successful, is your culture and leadership is key to it working.
And it's no surprise, is it? It's the same for health and safety. We've said for years and years and years, safety culture is key. If you don't have a safety culture, you can put the best policies and processes in place, but they'll fall down. And it's exactly the same stress.
Absolutely.
So, Kelly, for the employers and the safety professionals that are listening today, what would be your key takeaways from a HR perspective?
So for me, I think the key things is make sure you're in good communication with your employees. The ideal thing to do, as David said, is to look at doing even like anonymous surveys, doing like employee engagement surveys and things like that, just so you're actually getting the information. The second thing really would be to make sure that your absence management procedures are kind of up to date, and managers actually know how to have those conversations, because it's all right kind of having a script or having a form that you fill in. But actually, as I said before, it's about ask the question twice and actually get to know your employees. And then I think really it is just try to know your people. And ultimately, if you think there's something wrong, have a conversation. Don't just think, oh, they're just having an off day. Have a conversation, because there might be something more going on there.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's some good information for people to take away for sure. And David, what about from a health and safety perspective?
Well, I think the key fundamental is your stress management risk assessment. You need to have that in place, and you then need to look at how you are going to carry out your stress indicator tools, and asking the right questions to understand that what people's demands look like. Have they got the right control? They got the right support? Do they understand their role? How do they feel that the organisation is with dealing with change? So you want to get an understanding of that. Once that gives you feedback, then you're going to look to go into sort of your focus groups for those different areas within the organisation, and having people come together. Now, in an ideal world, you would do 6 to 10 people, because they say that that's the ideal number of people. And then what you take away from that, and looking to implement that, and make those changes. And then if you identify that there's any individuals that are struggling, it's about recognising that and pointing them in the right direction to speak to HR, and make sure that they've got the right support that they need. And the only one thing is culture and leadership is key to it all.
So Kelly, thank you very much for your time today. It's been great
You're
to have you with us, and some really good insight there for people to take away for sure. It's really interesting to see the crossover between health and safety
Absolutely.
and HR. And I think that that's going to be a very important part of the sort of safety landscape going forward. People are going to have to get comfortable crossing that border a little bit and working with colleagues to better understand and tackle those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Okay, Simon, so we thought in this part we would look at health and safety and look at the past,
That's
the
right.
present, and the future.
Yes.
So what is yours going to be this time round?
So with stress, I think the key for me is that the whole perception within the industry has changed over the last 10 years. If I think back to 10 years ago, in those days of sort of my career, stress wasn't really one of the things that was on the conversation cards. We didn't talk about it a lot as safety professionals. We then hit COVID. So mental health awareness became huge. People's understanding of stress became huge because more people were feeling it, firsthand. And then coming out of COVID, there was this greater awareness. So we knew it was there. We knew it was important. But even so, there was still a hell of a lot of confusion in the industry about whether stress was a health and safety matter or whether it was HR, and how that crossover went with mental health and mental illness. I think what we've seen, I would say probably in the last 3 years, is a lot more clarity that stress is an occupational hazard, because the environment and the work environment causes that ill health, and that ill health has physical impacts, physical symptoms. So, that bit does definitely fall under health and safety. So I think we're in a position now where finally that is understood. So it's understood by the regulators, it's understood by health and safety professionals. And so we're starting to really try and get a grip of stress management as a profession. So I think that's where we are now. And then going into the future, I think we're going to see that heightened. I think it's going to be less of a known thing we need to do that's a challenge, and more part and parcel with health and safety. And people will become more confident dealing with it, they'll become more experienced dealing with it, and we'll see much greater impacts within the whole workforce, and see health and safety professionals having a greater impact in reducing stress, which is ultimately great for the entire workforce of the country. So how about yourself? What do you think for your past, present and future?
So I was thinking about this and the way that we were going to do it. And then it got me thinking, if we go back 5-10 years ago, any time that we would see, hear about a prosecution,
Yeah,
it was mostly of, obviously, there's been a fatality,
of course.
so something serious had happened, and it's very reactive. And then we would look to be putting controls in place to obviously prevent that from happening. Whereas now I would say that that's totally changed. What we're seeing is that no one's died, but that they've not got the right controls in place to prevent people from having ill health.
Yeah,
So that seems to be a major place where the focus has went to, just like you were talking about there. They're obviously looking at like asbestos and silica and so on, and people being exposed to that. So now people are being prosecuted if they've not got that in place. And then where we're looking at the future and where I could see it going is that we've obviously spoken a lot about stress in the workplace. We have recently seen that a business was issued with a notice of contravention for failing to manage stress within their workplace, which is huge. And I could see it in 5-10 years' time, where if people continue to fail to put the right controls in place, that they could be prosecuted for that, which is a huge change from where we were to where we're at.
absolutely. Yeah, and we're seeing that change in general, aren't we? From the traditional safety matters that are very plain, very evident. Someone getting hit by a forklift truck is a very obvious, distinct event.
Yeah.
Moving into health is challenging because you don't see it. It's not as evident. And like you said, with noise and vibration, you can hear the noise, absolutely. But unless you're really actively looking for it, it's very different to seeing someone get hit by a forklift truck. And it's built up over time.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same with stress. So I think you're right. There's a lot of change moving into the health side. And stress definitely falls within that. So it'll be interesting times for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, Simon, so obviously you are the fire guy and the knowledge, the expert. So in this one, we're going to do a rapid fire. So what have you got for us?
So there's loads of change going on at the moment. So I have got notes. I'm going to have to use my notes for this one. So I'm going to try a Martin Lewis style rapid fire update of what's going on in the industry.
Yeah.
So people have an idea what to look out for.
Yeah.
There is an awful lot this month. So I'll give it a go. So first thing, residential PEPs, personal evacuation plans. This is a massive change. Any building that's 18 metres above with residents or 11 metres and above with simultaneous evacuation, where people can't readily evacuate themselves in the event of a fire, must have personal evacuation plans in place. However, it's really complicated in terms of getting them done. So the responsible person needs to identify who they are and ask them if they want one. And there's all sorts of intricate details about how that information is shared, who with the fire service. So if you fall into that category, you really need to do your research, see if it applies to you, and then put those processes in place, because that will absolutely be looked at by fire authorities. And that was law as of April this year. So that is huge. We are seeing massive shifts in the industry in terms of training. So there was a new competency standard that came out last year, a British standard around the competency of fire risk assessors. So anyone that's moving into fire risk assessing now will need to do a slightly different training pathway, because they've all aligned the training courses to this standard. What that typically means is you now need to do a more defined pathway of a level 3, moving into a level 4, moving into a level 5, as you go through the complexities of different fire building types, risk types. So that's very different to what it used to be before. There was nothing really prescribed. It typically used to be a level 3 will cover you for pretty much everything. So that has definitely changed. If you were in the industry as a fire risk assessor before, don't panic, because the level 3 that you had before is more or less equivalent to the current level 4 for intermediate buildings. But definitely fire risk assessors need to be on top of that competency standard and looking at the training requirements that go with it as well. Then there are a number of consultations that are open at the moment. The big one, again, is fire risk assessors. So one of the big things out of Grenfell is that fire risk assessors are going to have to be on a register. a single register that's UCAS accredited. The government is consulting on that now. So the consultation is open at the time of recording. So anyone who's involved in fire risk assessing at all should have a look at that and get their feedback in, so that everyone has their fair say, and the government sees the views of the fire risk assessment landscape. Moving on to others, there's new guidance being drafted to replace what were the old DCLG guides. So this is going to be a positive step forward because it will help to simplify and clarify a lot of the old guidance. There's a consultation open right now for the guidance around care homes. So anyone who's got an interest in that should provide their consultation as well. There's another consultation open. So approved document B is the building regulations guidance document that relates to fire safety. It's more about the building design rather than the fire risk assessment, but that is currently under review as well. So that's an important one for anyone who's remotely interested in the design of buildings. And there's some big changes coming through in that as well. And finally, there's a British standard coming out on how to conduct fire risk assessments in construction sites. So anyone who's working in construction, whether that be the employer, tradespersons, or the person doing the fire risk assessment, should be looking for the launch of that British standard, because that will be a benchmark for how to do fire risk assessments in that industry. Because it is complicated, it's a changing landscape all the time. That site is constantly changing, and your traditional control measures don't apply or don't always apply. So 100%, if you're in that industry, you need to be ahead of that launch.
So there's obviously a lot there.
There's a lot.
What I would say is, what does that mean then if you're an employer? What do you need to look out for, and what do you need to do?
As an employer, you need to be keeping your eye on the landscape constantly. If you're using AI tools, you can set them up to constantly scour the web on a routine basis to give you updates. You need to be subscribing to government bulletins in relation to fire safety, so that you understand what's coming through and you can see the consultations as they launch.
Does it mean that they always as well need to make sure when they're selecting people to do their fire risk assessment that they meet these
Absolutely.
standards?
Absolutely. So competency has always been important, but it's not been very well defined. It is now well defined. And so absolutely, businesses should be looking to make sure that the people doing their fire risk assessments are competent. It's the first thing the fire authority will look at. And if they're finding problems in the fire risk assessment, they will hold the employer to account for not selecting somebody who was competent. Now, definitive proof of competency is still hard. I think once we get this register, the single register, that's going to help. At the moment, there's no register for individual fire risk assessors, only organisations. So, in the future, we're definitely going to see something that will help. But for the time being, absolutely, employers need to make those reasonable inquiries to make sure that the people doing their fire risk assessments are competent to do so.
Amazing. I think that Martin Lewis better watch his back.
I think he's got skills I need to learn. So David, last time we did this, you asked me some really tricky questions to try and figure out which one was true. So now I'm going to get my own back.
I didn't agree to this.
What I've done, I've scoured the web for an interesting fact, and I made it link back to mental health and stress. And in the theme of going back in time, it's actually a slightly older study. So I found a really interesting article from the World Health Organization from all the way back in 2021, but it had some really interesting facts that came out of this. So International Labour Organization did a research project across the world, and they found some interesting facts about the links between long working hours and the increased deaths from heart disease and stroke.
Oh, okay.
Between 2000 and 2016, the number of deaths from heart disease due to working long hours increased by what? Is it 10%? Is it 17%? Or is it 42%?
Oh. Well, I always like to go with higher numbers, so I'm going to say 42%.
Good guess. Yeah, it's 42%. Is absolutely staggering.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly high number. And that's obviously coming from around the world, so it's not equally represented in different countries. But yeah, I think that really makes the point about that link between stress and physical symptoms, and it coming from the workforce. I mean, some interesting stats here. They're talking about a long week being at least 55 hours. Okay. And I dare say there are a lot of people in the UK that will be working more than 55 hours and will fall into this category. But the other thing that was really interesting here, I'm going to ask you a second question.
Okay.
You didn't know I was going to do a second question either, did you?
I don't like it.
So
Question.
I'm taking advantage while I got you. So look, we can both relate to this as parents of young children, and it's fatigue due to lack of sleep. Okay. Did you know that the lack of sleep can equate to similar physical attention issues as being drunk?
Well,
It can. So I'm going to ask you a question around that.
yeah.
So, after 17 consecutive hours awake,
Yeah.
impairment is equivalent to having a blood alcohol content of 0.5. Is that true or false? For context, that's the equivalent for a typical person of having 2 beers.
Ooh. I always just like to go against it, so I would say false. It's actually higher.
It's actually true.
Oh.
It's actually true. So 17 consecutive
still.
hours awake gives the same impairment as 2 beers. So if we think about people working at construction sites,
Yeah.
those, you wouldn't allow somebody to come onto a construction site and work with heavy machinery if they've had 2 beers, but would you be considering 17 hours of lack of sleep?
Yeah.
Similarly, after 24 hours awake, impairment is equivalent to a blood alcohol concentration of 0.08. True or false?
True.
False.
Oh.
0.1. 0.1. But that's twice as much.
Yeah.
That concentration is twice as much again. So that's severely intoxicated after 24 hours of lack of sleep.
Yeah.
So, this really stood out to me because there's a lot of people in the UK that, for whatever reason, are going to be having a lack of sleep. But this actually came from the Centre for Disease Control in America, a really interesting study back in 2024 about the risks of driver fatigue on the job and long driving hours. We obviously have controls with tachograph systems and things for driving in the UK. But again, getting some of the context here around the physical aspects that come from stress, that come from long hours, come from lack of sleep, it's quite staggering, the impact it can have.
That is interesting. As you say, there's a lot of contributing factors, like you could have young children and so on while you're not sleeping. So yeah, very interesting.
So David, as head of the advice team, I know you've been digging into data recently to look at trends and what patterns we're seeing. What sort of patterns and takeaways are you seeing from our data at the moment in terms of key enforcements?
Yeah, so I did. We always keep obviously on top of our data and seeing the trends. But what I've done is I've went and actually looked at the past sort of 5 years. And where we look at any sort of incidents and leading on to enforcements, we're seeing that there's 3 key hazards.
Okay.
And that is workplace transport, contractors,
Right.
and off-site activities.
Okay.
So where we look obviously at workplace transport, of people not having traffic managements in place, no segregation between people and transport. And typically if something goes wrong in that area, you're dealing with serious incidents or fatalities. So we are seeing a real issue with workplace transport. Then contractors. Contractors is a huge thing, and obviously people managing their contractors that they are using. So we're seeing it where maybe they haven't vetted that contractor to make sure that they are capable of doing the job and they do it in a safe manner. And a big part of that as well is actually monitoring.
Yeah.
So you bring on contractors and it's great that maybe you've done all the right checks, and they pass everything, but it's actually that sort of monitoring and supervision piece where people can be failing, and we see that there can be enforcements that come from that. And then the third one is off-site activities, so where you're going away from your premises where you work, and you're going and carrying out jobs where you're not in control necessarily of the environment, and they might not have the be doing dynamic risk assessments, having their RAMs in place, and we're seeing that there's a real issue to people managing and controlling the hazards that comes to off-site working. So for me, that's the three main areas, and that is where I would suggest that people look at how are they managing these three hazards, and look at obviously making sure they focus in on that and putting in the right controls.
Makes a lot of sense. And they apply to a lot of businesses as well. Yeah, makes sense. Fantastic. Thank you very much. So, David, we covered an awful lot of content today.
We have.
What are your key takeaways for listeners?
So my key takeaways from today would be where we're looking at stress management in the workplace. Making sure that you've got your risk assessment in place, and make sure that obviously that you are asking the right questions to your employees and including them in that process, and then putting in the right controls. Where we look at enforcements, as I say, there's those three key areas that I would ask people to look at and see how they are managing these hazards, and make sure that, as I say, that they focus in and put in the right controls for these areas, because they're most likely to cause them major incidents and enforcements to come off of the back of that. And then if we look at yourself, what would be your key takeaways?
So I'd say if you are working in a housing environment, definitely have a look at residential PEPs. If they apply to you, you need to be aware and taking action on that straight away, because it's law. If you work in any way in the fire industry, you should be looking at the consultations that are open at the moment so that you have your say on the future of the fire risk assessment industry. And the final point would be, if you're an employer, you need to keep abreast of all of these changes. So definitely keep an eye on the changing landscape, set up all of your newsletters and alerts so you can see when different standards are changing, because it will have an impact on your fire compliance and your fire risk assessments ultimately.
So thank you very much for joining us today. We'll see you next time.